Have top of the hour, so trying to be respectful of your time since I know last week I ran a few minutes over. I want to try and get us out on time today because I know you all are busy. So let's go ahead and get the show on the road. I have gone ahead and started the recording. You guys should be able to see my screen. You hopefully can hear me as well. So we should be good to go. All right. So welcome to part 2 of our webinar series on Windows 10 migration. My name is Wally Mead, if you weren't aware of that, sorry about that. I'm a principal program manager with Cireson, been here for a little over 3 years after 22 years, I believe it was, at Microsoft, primarily working in the configuration manager product group, starting with SMS before it was SMS 1.0, so I've been around for a long time and know configuration manager fairly well, and now getting us more into the configuration manager space here at Cireson. So I'll talk about that in just a second. So this is part 2 of our presentation. We obviously already had a part 1, which was last Wednesday at this time. That presentation was recorded, and I'll show you where you can find the recording there in just a moment. So housekeeping items for you before we start off. You guys are in listen-only mode, so if you have questions or comments, go to the questions panel in your GoToWebinar interface and go ahead and type in your questions. I do not expect to be looking at those throughout the presentation because it distracts me, and I have enough things to distract me the way it is. So I'll get to those at the end of the presentations, but please do feel free to type up your questions or comments as they pop into your head so you don't forget about them at the end. I just ask that if you do type in questions or comments throughout the presentation, since I won't be looking at them till the end, if you put a little context about what you're around what you're talking about, so you just don't say, why not? And that was 45 minutes ago, so I don't know what your why not might be about. So other than that, we are recording. So this presentation will be up on our Vimeo site. And just for reference, I have our Vimeo site up here. So you go to vimeo.com/Team Cireson, and then all of our presentations from over the years are up here. We have well over 100 up there. And the first one that you'll see actually is part 1 from last week. So if you happen to have missed part 1 and you're just joining us for part 2, which I know there was a number of new registrations for part 2 that weren't in part 1, or if you wanted to review it again, or you wanted to look back at some of the demos I did, or pass it off to one of your coworkers who wasn't able to attend, you can just go to, again, vimeo.com/Team Cireson, and then it's actually the first link right now. It won't be probably tomorrow. It may be the second or third presentation, but you could always scroll down through and you'll see tons of different presentations from myself, as well as a bunch of other of our consultants and solutions architects. So anyway, all right. So our agenda for today, I'll spend just a couple of moments on who we are as a company at Cireson. I know those of you that joined us last week heard this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it since you have already heard it, and you can go back on the recording and get that information if you want. And then I'm going to do as quickly as possible a recap of what we did last week. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, why do that at all? Because you can go back and review the recording from last week, and that is true. But I want to do a recap because some of the stuff, or a lot of the stuff we talked about last week, will be applicable to today's presentation. So I'll just talk real quickly about what version of Config Manager should you use. Do you want to do an in-place upgrade or an OS replacement? How do you prepare Config Manager? How do you assess your readiness to go to Windows 10? And then the process we did last week, which was an in-place upgrade from Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 to Windows 10. So I'll do a quick recap of that. Then I'll show you a demo of those things just very, very quickly, and then show you where we ended up last week, and then what I did in my environment after we ended our presentation last week. And then we'll jump into today's information, which is primarily going to be around the rest of the OS deployment scenarios, like a bare metal deployment of Windows 10, because last week we concentrated on the in-place upgrade, which is Microsoft's recommended method to get to Windows 10 from Windows 7, 8, 8.1. But some of you, even in your comments last week, commented that you weren't as happy with it and you like to do the rip and replace or whatever. So, and you also will be getting new computers that you want to get provisioned. So we'll spend a lot of time on the installing Windows 10 from scratch. And then to show you what we did last week, as well as our deployment today, we'll go through quite a bit of time on monitoring your deployment status through the deployments node, through task sequence status and reports, as well as a couple other things to look at. So that's where we're going, but we will do a quick recap on last week and show you what our status is as of last week and where we're picking up today. Okay. All right, so who we are as a company, we've been around for 5+ years now. We started as a consulting services team doing consulting around System Center, primarily Service Manager. Found a lot of usability gaps in the Service Manager space, so started writing some quick little apps to help alleviate some of those pain points our customers are feeling. We saw that our customers really like those applications, so we started creating more and more apps. And that got us into other areas, including asset management. You guys are all configuration manager people, so you know the power that Config Manager has in the terms of hardware inventory and asset intelligence and software metering and so on, but there's no real solution within Config Manager to tie that all together with real asset management. So we wrote some applications around asset management that allow you to take your data from Config Manager, pull it into Service Manager into a CMDB, and then provide true lifecycle management of your hardware and software assets, getting information from Config Manager as well as allowing you to provision your own information. We have Service Management, which is a lot of those other apps that we built around Service Manager. So some of the console apps for the administrators, as well as the end user apps like our self-service portal and so on. And then obviously Configuration Manager. We have some applications around Config Manager, 4 free apps that I've talked about in previous webinars, as well as our Configuration Manager portal, which is a web-based experience to provide additional IT staff members primarily access to Configuration Manager without you having to give them the full console. Just here's some real quick statistics that we have and awards and recognition that we have. So lots of customers throughout the world, lots of consulting hours. Almost everybody that signs up with us and purchases our products renews on a yearly basis. Here just to look at a number of our, we call them fans, but just customers, whether it's in banking and finance or energy or healthcare, government, education, IT, including Microsoft and Dell. And then lastly, where our products fit in the Microsoft stack. So down at the lower layer, you have your solution, which will be your Windows-based solution running in Azure or Hyper-V. On top of that will be your System Center technologies, which all of our products rely on System Center, with the exception of we have one that doesn't, which is password reset, to help your IT teams not have to deal with password resets from end users. That one doesn't require any System Center. It can integrate with Service Manager, but it doesn't require it. And then Cireson, we sit on top of that, so on top of the System Center stack. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into a recap of what we talked about last week. And I'll try and go as quickly as possible here so we get a lot of time for today's conversation, which will be on bare metal deployments of Windows 10. So last week, what we talked about was how do you get prepared for Windows 10 deployment. So first we talked about what version of Configuration Manager. ConfigMan 2007, it's out of mainstream support, so no one really should be using it. There isn't really any good reason, plus the fact that it didn't really provide much for Windows 10 support other than as a normal client. You couldn't deploy it, however. ConfigMan 2012, which still is a supported product, and it does support Windows 10, including deployment. However, it only supports the first 2 releases of Windows 10. So Windows 10 builds 1507 and 1511. So not the 1607 or 1703 builds, they're not supported with ConfigMan 2012. So if you're keeping Windows 10 up to date, then certainly you need to be past ConfigMan 2012 as a technology. So that leaves us with Configuration Manager Current Branch. And that this is going to be your best solution for not only deployment of Windows 10, but as well as management of Windows 10. And the management of Windows 10 is really what we're going to talk about and concentrate on in next week's webinar. which would be now that you're deployed Windows 10, how do you take advantage of some of those features within Configuration Manager? It provides support for all the different versions of Windows 10 that are still supported by Microsoft, and including all future versions of Windows 10 or builds of it. It does supply OSD, operating system deployment replacement, break fix, wipe load, refresh scenarios, whatever we want to look at, as well as the in-place upgrade support, which we talked about last week. So all those normal scenarios that you've had in the past, plus your in-place upgrade built into the product. So current branch is really the technology you want to be sitting on. If you're still on ConfigMan 2012, as long as it's the latest service pack, SP2 of 2012 or R2 SP1, you're still supported. You can use it. You just can't support anything past Windows 10 15.11. And there we go. Okay, then we talked about, do you want to do an OS replacement or OS upgrade, in-place upgrade? The in-place upgrade is a recommended solution to get to Windows 10 if you're assuming you're on Windows 7 and later. A lot of people do that, including Microsoft. They did 100,000, couple 100,000 clients through in-place upgrade of Windows 10. So very, very popular way and very smooth. It does allow you to change your mind or roll back within 30 days of upgrade, and it retains all your apps and data. So it's a very quick, easy upgrade process. Now, replacement, which is more what we're going to talk about today, is good when you want to have hardware refresh scenario. So your hardware is out of date. You want to replace the hardware. You're going from x86 to x64 architecture. You want to repartition the hard drive. Maybe go from multiple smaller partitions and one huge one, or whatever the case is. You do have to remember that you have to manually copy all your data from your users and then restore them after your OS replacement scenario, and reinstall your apps because you're obviously wiping out the hard drive. You could use USMT to help save off the data and then just use your task sequence to specify what apps you want to have installed, or put them in your image, or use normal native configuration manager software distribution technologies to get those apps back out. Okay, then preparing your environment. So what do you do in Config Manager? You have to make sure you have a valid version of the Windows 10 ADK, so the assessment and deployment kit, which is required. The 1507 release is the bare minimum you have to be passing the prereq checker for Config Manager to be able to install it. And then the later the build of the ADK, the more or the later the releases or additions of Windows 10 are supported. So the Windows 10 ADK for build 1703 would obviously support the deployment of 1703 as well as all the way back through Windows 7. And generally, again, the recommendation we specified last week was to stay on the latest ADK. You have to prepare WinPE boot images for Configuration Manager. Now, it wasn't as big of a deal last week as the in-place upgrade doesn't really use boot images. However, all the other scenarios do, which we'll talk about today. Import device drivers as necessary. And we mentioned the recommendation to keep the number of device drivers to a minimum, the lowest number that you really need. And generally, you don't need to put any in your boot images unless you need specific, very specific network or storage drivers in your WinPE boot image. Then you prepare your Windows 10 source files for deployment. We talked about two different methods yesterday: operating system upgrade packages, which is what you use for the in-place upgrade that we showed you last week. And then today we'll look at the operating system image scenario. So capture scenario or use the install.wim. So we'll talk about the OS images for deployment in our bare metal deployment we're going to do today. Verify that all the required content, so the boot images, the OS image, the OS upgrade package, your device driver packages, your applications, your software updates, and so on, verify that they've all been distributed to distribution points that your computers will have access to. Ensure that your proper site system roles are deployed. You obviously have to have a site server, site database server, management point, distribution point, otherwise you really don't have a site that you can do anything with, or maybe not even a site at all. Additional site system roles you may want to have for operating system deployment purposes would be a PXE-enabled distribution point if you want to do bare metal, a state migration point if you want to use USMT and not have to do hard linking, but just use USMT as a state migration point with the state migration point to save off and restore your user data files. You obviously want to have a software update point so you can keep your systems up to date. You're very likely going to want to have a reporting services point, which will be utilizing today, looking at some of the reports in Configuration Manager related to our deployment process. And fallback status point, there's certainly a bunch of other site system roles, but those are the ones that are really required. Because you are going to be using WinPE boot images today, and in a WinPE scenario, your computer is not domain joined at the time of running under WinPE, and it's running under the context of the local system account, so no user. So you don't have a computer account nor a user account you can use to access your distribution point. So this is where you really have to have something called the network access account available for your clients or their computers when they're running under WinPE to be able to gain access to your distribution point. I was just working with somebody last week and they couldn't get bare metal deployments to work, and it wound up being they forgot to add a network access account. So fairly basic, but something you do need to verify. And then verify your boundary group provides access to distribution points. So since you're going to be in a bare metal scenario, WinPE, you may be using DHCP, so you just need to make sure that your boot image, when it's running, will have access to the distribution point, not only with an account, but also being able to access it through your boundary group access. All right, so once you've got that all prepared, we'll look at some of those things in demos coming up. We talked about determining your upgrade target. So when you're doing the upgrade, you want to make sure that you're not just blindly throwing out the Inplace Upgrade to everybody and then having a lot of failures, because some of those systems are not going to be compatible. So we talked about a few different ways of determining your upgrade readiness. One was using the upgrade assessment, which is part of the Windows 10 setup functionality. And I showed you just a simple checkbox that turns it into compatibility scan only mode. So it doesn't really do the upgrade, just scans to see if Windows 10 setup can find any incompatibilities. And then upgrade analytics, which is a cloud service using OMS to go ahead and collect data and then report it back down through the upgrade analytics dashboard within Config Manager. You can certainly create your own collections and queries. So if you have your own idea of what you need to have met as far as requirements in your environment, like you always want to have 4 gig of RAM, you always want to have a 500 gigahertz processor and 100 gigabytes of free disk space and whatever else. You can create your own collections using hardware inventory data for your upgrade scenarios. And then there's a set of reports that are primarily old that are built into the product. And then lastly, we went through the process of creating a task sequence to do the in-place upgrade. So the task sequence is the final piece of the puzzle that ties everything else together and gets the commands out to in this case, an existing client to do an upgrade from Windows 7 or Windows 8.1, the two that I performed last week, up to Windows 10. So you have to create your own in-place upgrade task sequence, or today we'll do one for bare metal replacement scenario. And then you deploy the task sequence to the appropriate target collection. The clients will kick off the task sequence, and bingo, away you go. All right, so let's go look at that to show you where we got to last week and do a review of some of that stuff for you. So here's my environment that we used last week. So just to give you a heads up, all I did from last week was, as we ended last week's presentation, we kicked off the task sequence on our Windows 7 client. And that was actually a few minutes after our hour expired before we kicked that off. And then that's where we ended. And then after we closed out our presentation, I went ahead and kicked that same task sequence off on my Windows 8.1 client. So I let those two client computers do an upgrade to Windows 10. Once they got reported in as Windows 10, I shut everything down, snapped all the images, and that's what I booted up this morning. So everything is as of it was last week, about an hour and a half after we ended our presentation. When those two images had gotten done, I let them settle down for a little bit and report heartbeat DDR, and then I shut down the images and snapped them. So that's where we were. Okay, so what we did last week is we went to operating systems under the software library node. We went to operating system upgrade packages because that was our scenario last week was an in-place upgrade. So I created this Windows 10 source, which just as a quick reminder, it's not using an image file per se. Instead, it's using the full Windows 10 source files. So this is the Windows 10 source that I downloaded from the volume license or MSDN and downloaded that and it's using all those source files. This has been distributed to my distribution point, as you can see here, with the old great big green circle. So we're good to go there. We did an upgrade assessment, and how we did that is I created a task sequence called Windows 10 Upgrade Assessment. And all I did in that, I took the standard task sequence, the same task sequence as my upgrade that we ran later on. And all I did in that task sequence was to, on the upgrade operating system action, was to go ahead and select this checkbox to say, perform compatibility scan. Now let me turn it back to red so it highlights better since some of the other stuff is blue. So I did the perform Windows setup compatibility scan without starting the upgrade. So I did that, and both clients came back. We showed the SMSTS log that had the return code, the exit code, that since it's equated to no compatibility issues were found. In fact, the log file did even tell us that it found no compatibility issues. This task sequence, if I go look at the properties, you'll see that it was not tied to a boot image. So you can see the option here. It says use a boot image is not selected. So it's not using a boot image. All it was utilizing is the OS upgrade package. So we did that, and then we went ahead and ran the upgrade task sequence. So again, this task sequence, not tied to a boot image. So it doesn't require a boot image. And if we do the edit, it's the exact same as the previous one we saw. It just does not have that one checkbox for performing the scan. I just clicked it, so it's turned on now, but it was not turned on there. It was just left that way. So I created that task sequence. We went to references, saw that it only did utilize the operating system upgrade package, which was distributed in my distribution point. So I went ahead and did a deployment of this task sequence to a collection of clients. Now, so that collection of clients was Windows 10 Upgrade Assessment was the collection name. And here is that collection. Oops, here's that collection. And right now you see it has no members in that collection. That's because both those computers are now upgraded to Windows 10. I was using a query rule that was limited from all workstations, as you can see here. And the query rule says just take all computers from all workstations that are running a workstation-based operating system that is not Windows 10. We ran the upgrade assessment on it. They both passed. We did the deployment, the in-place upgrade, and now they're no longer in that collection because they're no longer not running Windows 10. So here, if we look at the devices, you'll see here's my two computers here, client 7 and client 81. And if you look at the far right, you'll see that they both say they're running Microsoft Windows NT Workstation 10.0. So they have successfully upgraded. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on throughout the presentation. So, okay, so that's where we left last week. So now let's jump into today's information. So let's talk about performing bare metal deployments of Windows 10. So we looked at the in-place upgrade. So what about bare metal or your rip and replace, your wipe and load, your refresh, your break fix scenarios? They're all very, very similar. So I'm going to just talk about bare metal deployments, but again, all those others can be very similar. So we spent a lot of time last week on it. I just did a quick recap here for you. The overall process and preparation is very, very similar for the bare metal deployment as it is for the upgrade scenario. Now, some of the differences include bare metal deployments or all the other scenarios outside of the in-place upgrade really going to require a boot image. And because it requires a boot image, it also means you're going to need a network access account. And I'll show you those in the demo coming up here momentarily. So you're going to have a boot image to boot this bare metal client, and it's going to need a network access account to gain access to your distribution point. It's going to use an operating system image instead of the operating system upgrade package that we used last week. So it's going to use a WIM file as the source to get pushed out to these computers to install Windows 10. Whereas last week it was a flat set of files that it was using, and it pulled out some files out of there to do the install. This is going to take in install.wim or some other WIM file that you capture on your own. It's going to use a different task sequence. So I showed you just a moment ago the upgrade task sequence, which really only had 4 commands in it. One was to check my readiness just as far as memory, processor, operating system, do the upgrade, and then do a restart. That was really about it. There's going to be a lot more steps involved with a bare metal Windows 10 deployment. We'll see that momentarily. If you're doing a bare metal scenario using Pixie, so Pixie deployment, your distribution points are going to need to be Pixie enabled. So make sure that you have those, at least one of your distribution points configured for Pixie, and I'll show you how to do that quickly. Now, not all your other scenarios outside of Inplace Upgrade require Pixie DPs, but again, bare metal deployments, and a lot of people will use Pixie as a way to kicking off a OS deployment scenario. And then the boundary group, which controls your access to your distribution points, is likely going to need to contain your DHCP scope in that boundary group. So if you can do Pixie with static IP addressing, but most people that I encounter and run into, they're using DHCP. So you can add the IP address range from your DHCP scope as boundaries in Config Manager, and then add those boundaries into your boundary group, which provides access to your distribution point that has all this content on it. So that'll be the big thing to look at here, is making sure you have that. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of those and get a deployment kicked off here. Okay, so we go back to our environment. So some of the new things to look at here is, again, we're going to do bare metal deployment. So we'll go back to software library. We have to have boot images. And Config Manager is going to provide 2 boot images out of the box, a 64-bit and a 32-bit boot image. You can certainly go ahead and utilize those if you want to, or you can go ahead and create a custom boot image. And I showed you last week how to create a custom boot image. I created this Commence boot image. Commence is a OSD front end that Cireson provides as part of our Configuration Manager portal. So a lot of people like to have an OSD front end to help direct or guide the end users through the process if you want to give them some interaction capabilities. So I'm going to use the boot image x64 because I'm going to deploy a 64-bit version of Windows 10. So here's my boot image. I did not do any customizations to it at all. So if I go look at the properties of the boot image, you'll see that I did not add any drivers. You hopefully don't have to, but you can if you need to. I haven't added a pre-start command, haven't enabled command line support, which is a very common thing to do for testing scenarios. And I haven't added any optional components, which some people do want to utilize, and that's fine as well. One thing to be aware of on any boot image that you have, make sure that it is set to support a Pixie-enabled distribution point. The 2 built-in boot images in Config Manager, the boot image x64 and x86, they should have this set for you automatically. But any custom boot images you create, so if you go and add your own boot image by going up here to the Add Boot Image option, and then you point to a boot image and import it from MDT or some other version of the ADK, then you'll have to go in there and select that checkbox. So in my Commence boot image, I did have to go into the Data Source tab and select this checkbox because it would not be selected by default. And if you don't do that, then this boot image is not available for deployment from a Pixie-enabled distribution point. So that's a very common thing that people miss. All right, so notice that the boot image ID here, for the one I'm going to use, the boot image ID is 05, because we'll see that momentarily when we boot up our bare metal client. It should be using that boot image. Okay, and that boot image is distributed to our distribution point. That's fine. Our x86 one is not distributed to the distribution point. However, because I'm not going to use it, it is generally recommended by Microsoft that you do distribute both your x86 and x64 boot images to your distribution points, Pixie-enabled ones, just in the event that you have a client that needs to have it. It won't be able to load the 64-bit for whatever reason. Okay, so we've got that. Next, I have an operating system image, and my operating system image is Windows 10 Enterprise. If I go look at the properties of it, you'll see the data source for this is that same path where my OS upgrade package was from, Windows 10 source. However, I'm now specifying from a specific folder to go and pull the install.wim. So I'm taking the generic or base Windows 10 image that comes from the Volume License Servicing Center. So I would just go to download the Windows 10 code, and I got it in this folder stuff. And then here's Windows 10 source. And this is what my source files is for my OS upgrade package. However, for my OS image, instead of doing a capture process, I just went to sources, and I'm just utilizing the install.wim right here. So I'm just using install.wim that comes in my source. It's a generic one, obviously not customized. I would do any customizations with my task sequence to add in those applications or drivers or whatever I need in the deployment and leave that as a generic or base operating system image. So that's what I'm using here. The other alternative that you would have would be to go to task sequences, do a create task sequence, and you have this couple options here, build and capture. So you have build and capture if you want to take a bare metal client and install it as Windows 10, get it all prepped the way you want, then turn around immediately and capture it. So you can do that. And then Config Manager would do the building of that Windows 10 reference system and then capture it immediately for you and create an operating system image file out of it. Or you could go ahead and do a create task sequence media and then do this third option here, capture media. And that will create basically an ISO that you could burn to a DVD and then take that over to your reference computer that you would have manually installed and configured the way you want, capture it, which will do a sysprep on it of the operating system as well as config man client, remove it now, and then capture it and create a WIM file that you would then go and clear this and then go to operating system images, add operating system image, and then you just path out to that WIM file that you captured either through the build and capture process or your manual capture scenario. And I just happen to go here and just specify that install.wim is what I'm using. Okay, and that image is successfully distributed out to my distribution point, as you can see here. It's got the great big green circle there. So we're all good to go from that process. Okay, then I need a task sequence. So the task sequence, here I have install Windows 10. If I go look at the properties of that task sequence, go to the Advanced tab, you'll see that it is utilizing a boot image, whereas my in-place upgrade task sequences do not, but this one is. It is using boot image 05 that we looked at before, the built-in or default 64-bit boot image. And if I go and edit this task sequence, you'll see it has a lot more commands to it. So it's got sections here for capturing Windows setup, Windows settings, and network settings. Realistically, in a bare metal scenario, you would need to do the capture user files and settings or the restore user files and settings. However, I just went here and ran through this create task sequence, install an existing image package, and I walked through this task sequence, and here's state migration tab, and I just left the checkboxes all enabled. Normally, I would turn that off for a bare metal scenario, but if this was going to be a OS refresh scenario or maybe a wipe and load, maybe I want to do the USMT capturing and the restoring process. But then it tells it to restart into WinPE using the boot image that the task sequence is associated with. Check to see if the computer supports BIOS or UEFI mode and go to appropriate, partition the hard drive, download my image file. So download my operating system image, not the operating system upgrade package, download that and apply it. Then reapply my Windows settings, my network settings, do an auto apply device drivers. So do a plug and play analysis to see what device drivers I need, go to the driver library and pull those out, install the config man client, and then restore all my user state information. Now, if we take that and compare it to our upgrade task sequence that we looked at last week, or we deployed last week. So here you see those two task sequences, and obviously the upgrade task sequence is a whole lot less complicated, and my install Windows 10 task sequence by no means is complicated at all. You'll see some people, especially if they integrate with MDT and create an MDT task sequence, it has a lot more groups and a lot more steps in there, or they've added a lot more custom actions in there for installing applications, installing software updates, running some additional command lines to do things. So you'll see task sequences that are way more complicated and a lot longer than what I have here. This is just a walking through the wizard, taking the defaults. This is walking through the wizard, taking the defaults of the upgrade. And it just checks, make sure, again, we have the proper type of computer, does the in-place upgrade, restarts our computer. That's really it. Where this one's doing a whole lot more actions. And this check ready for readiness, you could certainly add this to this task sequence as well, which I would do just to verify. You guys have all heard of the scenarios where somebody accidentally sends out a Windows 7 image and all of a sudden their Exchange servers stop working. So no more mail because they happen to re-image their Exchange server with a Windows 7 image. Well, if you would have added this check readiness for upgrade or install and just verified client versus server, then that would have never happened. When the Windows Exchange server saw this task sequence, say, oops, I'm running a server-based OS and this says client-based OS, so it would bail out at that point in time, but would never got re-imaged. But something to consider there. Okay, so I have my task sequence. I would take that task sequence, go to the References tab. Oops, wrong one. Install Windows 10, References. It has a boot image, the client package, install config manager, USMT package, and then the Windows 10 operating system image. And you can see that all of those reference packages or objects, pieces of content, are successfully distributed to at least one distribution point. All right, so with that, before we go do our deployment, we want to have a PXE-enabled distribution point because we're doing bare metal, so go to distribution points. And you see I have two DPs in my environment, primary and member. And you can see that I already have one of them being primary is PXE enabled. So all I did to primary, I just went to the PXE tab. And you can see what I configured. I enabled. I told it to allow to respond to incoming PXE requests. I enabled unknown computer support. A lot of companies don't like to do that. They like to only image known computers. And in Config Manager, you can go ahead and pre-register computers so that they're known to Config Manager by their MAC address or their SM BIOS GUID, so that you're not worried about somebody plugging in a computer you don't know about into your environment, doing a PXE boot, and then getting your image. So that's fairly common. I just like to keep things simple, so unknown computer support. I'm not requiring a password, but for security reasons, you may want to require a password and specify it. And then I said allow UDA with automatic approval. That went ahead and installed WDS for me. And then I went ahead and distributed, made sure I had my two boot image or my boot image and my OS image package distributed out to my PXE enabled distribution point. Now, again, I'm going to be running in PXE mode. So WinPE, I need a network access account. So go to site configuration, go to sites, and then do a right click. Oops, no, I'm on my site code, sorry. Right click and configure site components, software distribution, and go to the network access account tab. And I do have one. You may need to add multiple different network access accounts because maybe you have multiple different domains that are untrusted, so they would not be applicable for accessing your distribution point. So you may need to go ahead and add multiple different network access accounts. And I believe the current limit that's supported is still 10. You just go add an account, just a domain user, so it has access to your distribution point. So I've got that configured. And now the last thing we do is take our task sequence and we deploy it. Let's go back to our task sequence, install Windows 10. I have a deployment of it to my Windows 10 deployments collection. However, I'm doing unknown computers. So let's go ahead and create a new deployment, install Windows 10, deploy, and I'm going to go ahead and click Browse. ConfigMan pops up and says, hey, this has the potential to be a high-risk deployment. So we're going to filter out all your built-in collections, with the exception of one that I'm going to use, and your other custom collections have some filtering on them automatically. So now you can see my list of collections, no all systems, which is great, no all desktop and server clients, which is great. The only built-in collection that it still has is all unknown computers, which its sole purpose in life is for bare metal deployments, which is what I want. And then all my custom collections here are there as long as they don't have any more than 2 members. I went ahead and set my hide factor to 2. If I clear that, you see it adds a couple more collections in here that had more than 2 members in it. So all servers, all workstations. By default, that's value set at 100, and I went ahead and limited mine to 2, just so I'd have something appear or disappear. So I'm going to go ahead and do all unknown computers. I'm going to make this a required task sequence, which is okay for bare metal. If it's an in-place type upgrade, you probably want to make it available. So you have to go to Software Center and then launch it out that way. But I'll do only media and Pixie for safety reasons. It's required, so I have to give it a schedule, and I'll say as soon as possible. In bare metal, this is not going to make any sense, but I would always select the allow users to run this program independently of assignments. That way, if I wanted to, especially for troubleshooting, I could load Software Center and go to the operating system tab and launch off this task sequence manually. For existing clients, you probably also want to do the ignore maintenance windows for system installation, so that you can go ahead and install your task sequence whenever you want to, especially if it's user driven. Now with the required scenario, you may not want to. But again, for bare metal, this one doesn't really make any sense because I don't have Software Center because it's not an installed client and there's no maintenance windows. I'm not going to worry about any alerts. I'm going to let it get content from the distribution point on demand, and it's all set, ready to roll. And it has now created my policy. So it's created that policy, which is the deployment for my task sequence. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go and switch over to my bare metal client image, which is sitting right here. We're going to go ahead and turn him on. And if the policy has been created, first thing you should do is get an IP address from DHCP. Hopefully that happens momentarily here. Come on, DHCP. May have to go and kill him and start him back up. Sometimes that happens with bare metal clients. So I'm going to go ahead and kill that guy. Let me go to Hyper-V Manager. I see that sometimes when images are set running too long. Let me just go to reapply the snapshot and then start him back up. There we go. Now I got an IP address. It went to Config Manager, finding a policy. It's found a policy. And now if you see down at the bottom, it says CHQ00005, which is my x64 boot image. So it has found the policy, the task sequence that told it to go ahead and download the x64 boot image, which it's doing right now. Once it does that, it'll go ahead and prepare the network drivers, prepare Windows, which is WinPE, and then it's going to go ahead and validate whether I'm in can do UEFI or I'm doing BIOS, partition the hard drive, format the hard drive, download the install.wim file, which is my operating system image, and go ahead and install that. So this is not going to finish before we're done with our webinar, this whole process, but we'll watch it for just a second longer while we go back, and we'll see what the status is when we end up our presentation for the day. This will just take another moment, and the boot image will be downloaded. And now WinPE it's downloaded the image into RAM disk, drive X, and it's initializing it. And what should happen here momentarily is it tells us it's counting down. It's going to take 3 minutes before it kicks off. I'm just going to say kick it off right now. Now you see it's, in this scenario, it's doing BIOS. So it's partitioning the hard drive in a BIOS scenario. And then it's formatting drive C. And the next thing we're going to see is it's now applying the operating system. So it's downloading install.wim. So it's downloading that install.wim, then it's going to go ahead and install that operating system. So just walking through that task sequence, there wasn't anything to capture with the with the USMT scenario, and it's almost done downloading, and then it's going to go to the apply operating system. So now it's installing Windows 10. So again, that's going to take a number of minutes to run through. So we'll just let that guy go. So we've got a task sequence that's now running. I ran a couple of task sequences last week. How do you monitor to see what your status is? So there's a number of different ways of doing monitoring. For true monitoring of what the task sequence is doing, what your status is, you're either going to use in-console monitoring, which you go to the monitoring workspace, go to the deployments load, select that task sequence, run summarization on it, refresh, click view status, pick your action that you want or your status, and click more details, and then go to the status tab to get a step-by-step display of what's been going on with that task sequence. So you can do that if you like the in-console monitoring method. If you like reporting, then in task sequences, there's a few different groups or folders for task sequences. And there's, I think it's, last I counted, it was 28 different reports for task sequences. So one to look for status is the status summary of a specific task sequence deployment, and that's in the task sequence -deployment status folder. So you can start there. Also, what you'd want to do is verify that when the clients have gotten their new operating system, verify that they are reporting the new operating system. So as I just showed you previously, when I showed you my my devices node, I showed you client 7 and client 81. It said Windows NT Workstation 10.0. That comes from Heartbeat Discovery. So you want to make sure the Heartbeat Discovery data is up to date. And if it's not, then just go ahead and force a discovery data collection cycle on the client, and that will go ahead and force it to do Heartbeat Discovery, because by default it's weekly before it'll send it in. And then it'll report in its current operating system that it gets from the query that's done with the Heartbeat Discovery. And that'll be the operating system name and version attribute. If you want to do reports, the vast majority of your reports that would display any operating system data, that information usually comes from hardware inventory. So you'd want to make sure that your hardware inventory data is up to date. If not, go ahead and force a hardware inventory cycle if it's not up to date. And that will go ahead and force the client to send in a new new hardware inventory data, which would include the new operating system. A good report that I like to use is the Count Operating Systems and Service Packs report. And that's from the Operating Systems group or folder. And that one does use hardware inventory data. So you want to make sure that that is up to date so that you can do reporting successfully on your status. And then another thing to look at, it's in the current branch release of Configuration Manager. So those of you still running on ConfigMan 2012, you don't have this, but there's now a Windows 10 servicing node inside the software library, so just below operating systems. And that is where all your Windows 10 clients are going to report into your environment for later management as for automated upgrades. And I'll show you this in just a moment here. So you just want to hover over the Windows 10 usage donut, and that will highlight for you and show you the number of systems that are running that bill that you're highlighting in that donut ring, the donut portion of that ring. And I'll show you that again in just a second here as we get into the next demo. Now, the servicing portion of that we'll talk about next week, where we'll talk about how do you keep your images up to date. So, because you know Windows does release new builds occasionally, so how do you keep those up to date? We'll talk about that, servicing of them using the servicing dashboard next week. Okay, so let's go over here and let's jump back into our demo and see where we're at. Oh, we got an error. Very interesting. So I have to go look at the error on that and see what happened. I wonder if I gave this guy enough memory, but that's not cool. It worked yesterday when I verified things were working. I'll have to go look at him. But anyway, go back to our environment and we'll look at we can go look at some of our status here and see what we get. So deployments, monitoring. So go to monitoring, go to our deployments, and here is our deployment we just kicked off. So install Windows 10 to the all unknown computers collection. Notice it has no status. And this other one that install Windows 10, that's to another collection that I don't have any, and not running that one. So this is the one we're running. So what you want to do here is do a run summarization. Click OK, and then for me, it's usually 15 to 17 seconds, and I'll get my status. And then you go ahead and do a refresh. So I always click the double blue arrows at the end of my breadcrumb trail here. To click that, do a refresh. Then here's our task sequence. You see it's great big red. You don't want that. You want green, obviously, or yellow if it's in progress still. So how we view our status here is then go click on View Status. We don't have any success. I was hoping we'd have in progress still, but obviously we have an error. So click the error. It's an unknown computer. And then task sequence engine failed. Execution of the task sequence. You can click more details. And nothing on this page, but if you go to the status page, and it could very well be that my disk has filled up because it does that when I'm doing OSD with the drive I'm sitting on. We'd have to go look up that error code to see what it has. Action output. But here's how you can just view your status inside the deployment status node. For example, last week's the upgrade to Windows 10, 100% completion, success, view status. I don't have any errors, in progress, anything else. So here's the two computers, client 7, which one we kicked off. More details, and just click that just to show you. It shows you every single task that it went through, and you can see that it took a total of about 34 minutes to install my task sequence. So to complete that. And that was for the Windows 7 client, and for the Windows 8.1 client, you can see I kicked that off the same day, about 12:16. So it took 34 minutes again. So right about 35 minutes to do the in-place upgrade scenario. Okay, so that's the dashboard. That's the deployments node. You can also do reporting. So if you go to reporting and reports, and then scroll on down to task sequences, you'll see that there's a few different folders here. And if you go to the deployment status, and then status summary is a specific task sequence deployment. And this will be a prompted report because you have to tell it which task sequence deployment you want to look at. It's retrieving report parameters here, so any second it's going to pop up and allow me to pick my task sequence deployment. And come on, there we go. And here are my task sequence deployments. So here's install Windows 10 to all unknown computers, so when we just kicked off. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily, it crunches everything together. So it's not as easy to read as normally we'd like it to be, but you'll be able to figure out what you're looking at. Click OK, then click View Report. And it loads the report parameters for you. In this case, failed. And unknown computer, since I did not get to the point of giving a computer name. It was past the installing, it was in the installing operating system task, and then got a failed here. My guess is that my hard drive filled up. We'll look at that in just a second. But if I go back to the beginning of the report, and let's choose a different task sequence like the one I ran last week, upgrade to Windows 10. And you see succeeded to, shows you the computer names. And again, it's just going to show you all those same steps, just a little bit easier to read in the report than it was in the status summary node from deployments. So you get a lot easier to see all the parameters and all the other output that's provided there. Okay, then I already kind of showed you this, but if I go to Assets and Compliance, go to the Devices node, you'll see here the column. You have to add this column in of operating system. And so you just want to make sure that your heartbeat EDR date and time is fairly up to date. You can see I ran these last week after the clients upgraded. I forced them to do a heartbeat DDR to get the Windows 10 reporting in. So that's all fine. You can also, if you want to do reporting, then the report you want to go to is the operating system group, and then count operating systems and service packs is a great report. And here you can see I still have one that says Windows 8.1. So what that tells me is that client 81 has not done hardware inventory since it reported in. In fact, you can see the, if I do another report, you can see the last time it ran hardware inventory. Or I could go ahead and look at that inside my devices node. So oftentimes I'll go ahead and add in the column here, the attribute for hardware inventory, hardware scan, and you can see that client 81, he ran at 11:40, which he had not kicked off the task sequence. He ran the task sequence, I think it was 12:06 or something like that. So he ran it before he upgraded. So I would just go to boot up client 81, force him to do a hardware inventory cycle, and then that report would go ahead and drop out the client 8, Windows 8.1, and I would have 3 computers listed as running Windows 10 Enterprise, client 10, client 7, and client 81, just by forcing hardware inventory. And the last thing we'll look at here is if I go back to software library, here's that node I was talking about, Windows 10 servicing. And this shows you all the different builds of Windows 10 you have installed, in which in my case, I only have one build, because you can see there it's only one section here to this donut ring. And I only have one ring ready, one ring that's available, which is release ready or current branch. I don't have any current branch for business turned on or LTSB. So if you just hover over this, it tells me I have Windows 10 version 1511, which is what I'm deploying here. It'll be the same for 1607 or 1703, the same basic process. And it says I have 3 of those because obviously my bare metal client did not work. So this is the way you'll be able to tell as well. And this utilizes heartbeat discovery data as well. So again, you want to make sure heartbeat discovery data is up to date, and that will populate the information here on your Windows 10 usage and under Windows 10 servicing. And again, we'll spend more time next week on creating servicing plans and looking at the life cycle that's left over of your Windows 10 environment. So we'll talk more about this next week, and then doing servicing to keep your environments up to date. Okay, and then just for grins, let me go over here and still have some disk space, so it looks like it may not be a disk space issue. Normally when when my task sequence fails, it is because of disk space, because I'm always running out of space with all the snapshots I have in my drives. So I will look at that one and see what the scenario was, because it never had a problem with that. All right, so let's go back here. So we are at the top of the hour, just a couple minutes beforehand. So I see a couple questions in the queue. We'll go ahead and talk about those or comments in just a moment. So System Center Configuration Manager is a great technology. If you're not up on the current branch release, you need to be on current branch, especially if you're in a Windows 10 environment or going to Windows 10. You realistically today can't use anything less than current branch. And if you're going to be going to 1703, the creator's updated Windows 10, remember that technically, I showed you this last week, that technically it's only the 1702 release of current branch of Config Manager that supports deployment and management of Windows 10 1703. So you got to keep your Config Manager up to date to be able to keep up to date with your Windows 10 environment. So you realistically want to be on the current branch 1702 release to be moving forward with Windows 10. As Windows 10 is as they call it, a fast-moving train now, you got to keep Configuration Manager on that same fast-moving train as well to stay up to date with it. Migration to Windows 10 is very easy with the In-Place Upgrade support, which we looked at last week. And then today at least we attempted to do a bare metal deployment of our Windows 10 client over there. So it failed for some reason. I'll do the troubleshooting after we're done here, since we're at the top of the hour. So I'll do that troubleshooting and let you guys know next week what our status was, and I'll get that client installed. I guess I should just snap my images yesterday after verifying that everything was working, and we would have had him there. I would have had 4 Windows 10 clients in my environment then instead of 3. So before you do your upgrade, you want to do your assess your readiness for doing the upgrade, which I showed you a number of different ways of doing that. It's still as worthwhile to do even the upgrade readiness or assessment, even if you're going to do a wipe and load. Bare metal, obviously you have to, you can't do an assessment of those clients because they're not running anything, but you'll know from the hardware that you're purchasing if there's any issues. And any new hardware you got, it's going to support UEFI, it's going to have current drivers that are Windows 10 compatible and so on. So it's really just going to be hardware that you've had out there for a couple of years that you're going to have to realistically do the upgrade assessment on. And then, as again, we tried to do today, a wipe and load, which is a bare metal scenario, is potential as well. So if you need help with this process, you decided you don't want to do it yourself, or you don't have the time to do it, you don't have the expertise to do it, again, we still do have consulting services, and we can help you out with that process. So it's not a problem at all. You can just email us at sales@cireson.com, and we can come out there and let you know we can do for you in terms of getting your Windows 10 environment up and ready to roll for you. And then we have I mentioned this last week, the Cireson community. So our own kind of forums that we used for people to ask questions on Cireson technologies, as well as System Center technologies. So people are out there creating feature requests on different products. Now, Config Manager, we can't do anything about that as far as the core product, but you can create feature requests for apps you'd like to see created for Config Manager, and we can look at those. So Cireson people are out there monitoring the community, as well as some customers and other consultants and partners and so on are out there monitoring it. So it's a great place to go, free community. You can go and join in if you want to. And then I mentioned a couple times the Cireson Configuration Manager portal. If you're interested in a web-based experience for software deployment and operating system deployment, help desk scenarios for Config Manager, then there's a free portal that you can gain access to by either going to Cireson.com. It'll be the first thing up on your website. You can go ahead and download a free trial evaluation version of it, or you can go to email team@Cireson.com. We can get you hooked up. We also have a Azure environment up and running where you can just play around with an environment that we have set up and test out, and a couple different scenarios. I think it's a help desk scenario as well as a server admin to play around with the portal as well. So there's a lot of options there, and you get a trial key if you want to put it in your own live environment in a fully functioning as opposed to evaluation version of the product. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and go through our questions. It is top of the hour, so I know some of you will probably be dropping off here as you got other meetings you have to go to. So thanks for your time. And again, this recording will get up on the vimeo.com/Team Cireson site in the next day or so you can go back and review it. But I'll hang out here for a number of minutes yet and answer questions. So, okay, there's my questions. Let me go here. I lost my mouse. Okay, Roger says, the two upgrades that completed, one looked like it was running tablet mode. If they're both a VM, why is one showing tablet mode? What designate that as I see it in my environment as well? Yeah, so what Roger is stating is, if we go back here and look at my environment, and we go back into assets and compliance, go back into devices, and then if we expand this out, client 7 shows as tablet edition. And this was the exact same image deployed to both my computers. And I'm going to have to check on that, Roger, because I honestly don't know why my Windows 7 client shows tablet edition currently, and the Windows 8.1 does not, when it was the same task sequence, the same OS image that was deployed, and even client 10 was deployed with that same download. So I don't know why this one came up. And actually, when I tested this out in a week prior to this, getting ready for the webinar, it was actually the other one. The client 8.1 came back and said it was tablet edition and not the not my client 7. I wonder why client 7. Oh, he got old hardware. Huh? That's obviously out of date. Let me go over here and do something, because it's certainly he has a current hardware scan. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been in my report. So what that tells me is it ran after. Let me go to client status and do a refresh client status. So hardware inventory probably ran after it summarized this morning at 8:19, and that may actually have. When I refresh this guy, he may change now back to non-tablet. Okay, not quite there yet. Come on, it doesn't take that long to do a refresh client status. There we go, 11:03. Now let's go back to our assets and compliance, look at our devices. Okay, so he's up to date as far as hardware inventory, but yeah, he still shows tablet edition. So I'm gonna have to go check on that for you. I honestly don't know why it's showing up as tablet edition, because it's the exact same build. It was again, a virtual machine that was running Windows 7. So I don't know what the difference is. So I will find that out, and we will mention that next week when I came back on that. Is it mandatory, Jay is asking, is it mandatory to install all security updates for Windows 10 servicing? So Windows 10 servicing, it depends on what you're implying there. You do want to have the latest security updates in there, but as far as the Windows 10 servicing node goes, that's going to be for the builds or the upgrades to Windows 10. So that's going to be going from 1511 to 1703, for example. So that's not necessarily your security updates. Now, there are security updates that you do have to have updated in like WSUS in order for it to show the upgrades classification. So you do want to keep up to date with your updates, but your security updates for the operating systems you deploy through normal software updates. The servicing node is where you're going to deploy the upgrade classifications for your clients. And we'll talk more about that last week, but is it mandatory to install all of them? No. You don't need to have, it's not mandatory. It just would be recommended best practice, obviously, to stay up to date. Troy, who is offline, asked what the Vimeo link again was. So let me go back there and I can just pop that back up for you. Here we go. So just it's back in there in the Q&A. So it's vimeo.com/Team Cireson. So vimeo.com Team Cireson is the link you want to go to, and you'll be able to find all of our recorded webinars. And then Srinivas, yes, this one is being recorded and will be posted up there as well. Keep on updated with latest security updates. Yeah, you do want to keep on updating your environment with, for Jay, with your security updates. Yes, you do want to keep up to date with them, but again, as far as the servicing node goes, that's different than your security updates. That's for the upgrades. So servicing of the upgrades to Windows 10. Okay, so Jay is saying because without the latest security updates, it doesn't show the 1703 upgrades. So yeah, you do have, again, you had to have a update to WSUS to show the upgrades classification initially. So yeah, you do need to keep up to date on things, but it's not mandatory just to deploy new operating systems that you keep up to date on your security updates, but you may have updates to WSUS or other technologies that are required to see some of those new products and classifications within Configuration Manager or WSUS for that matter. Okay, so Srinivas is asking how to create task sequence with patches, applications, drivers included. And John says SCCM is great. Thanks, Wally. You're very welcome, John. And I'll never say SCCM other than when I'm repeating something that somebody said. It's Configuration Manager. But anyway, so back to Srinivas's question. So create a task sequence, very simple. So go task sequence, go to operating systems, task sequences. And since I've already got this one for my install Windows 10, I'll just go ahead and take it and edit it. But it's very easy to go ahead and after you install Config Manager, so somewhere around here, you can just do an add, and then you go software, install application, install package, install software updates. So if you do install application, then it will let you go ahead and now with 1702, you can multi-select up to 99 applications in a single install applications step. If you do, and I'd probably make a new group here, not put it under the restore users, files and folders and so on. You do software install package, and then it's pick and choose your package that you want to have, and then set what program you want. And this one's not going to run because it doesn't have programs available for interactive mode. And then for software updates, required for installation, available for installation. So all software updates that are applicable to the client or only those that you set as mandatory or required for the client. And then there's a new option here that's and later, evaluate software updates results from cached scan results. So if you don't select this checkbox before it will do the install software updates, it is a scan on the client to see what's applicable, what's missing and available for the client, and then looks to see what's targeted to it and pulls those out. If you leave this checkbox enabled, it's not going to force a scan of the client prior to doing the software updates. It's going to go ahead and force that scan. If you leave the checkbox here, it's not going to force a scan. It'll just take whatever it last did. For example, maybe you're doing scanning on Friday at 8 a.m. and then it's Friday at noon, you're kicking off your upgrade process. Well, in that case, you probably don't need to scan again because you just scanned a few hours ago. But if it was Monday the last time you scanned and now you're doing your install on Friday, yeah, you probably want to do a scan just to make sure that you're current. So you can add those in after the fact, or when you're creating your task sequence, create task sequence, and you walk through the wizard. I'll just leave it at that. Name. I'll take my boot image. As you go through the wizard and pick whatever options you need here, I'll just tell this guy to join a work group just so I don't have to go and type in domain stuff. And config man client, state migration. And here's what I normally would have told to not capture and restore that stuff. Now here's software updates built into the wizard. And then install applications, again, built into the wizard. So you have those that'll be built into your wizard if you walk through the wizard to create your task sequence. So at that time, you can do that, or after the fact, you can go ahead, as I just showed you, do the add a new step in there. Okay. Okay, you want me to refer to latest WSUS and SCCM version to get the latest 1703 available on client machines, and like latest ADK and prerequisites. So yeah, just want to make sure that you're, and I'll do this for next week, Jay, is I will get, right now, if I look at my servicing node, and I go down to, oops, Windows 10 updates. Come on. There we go. You see that the last time I synced, I've got 1703 in here. So I've got 1703 for Windows 10 in here. And let me just do a 1703. So I've got 250 is what it came back with, Windows 10 1703s. And my image has not been on the network for quite a while. I don't keep my images on the network, so I'm not up to date all the time on things. But yeah, just keep up to date with all the updates to WSUS, and then Config Manager. This is Config Manager 1702 again, which is required for deployment of 1703. It's not supported for any other release. What are their prereqs for 1703 upgrade from 1607? I don't know of any specific prerequisites, other than, again, you normally want to keep your clients up to date as far as any security updates, but most people don't install everything. But there's no other big requirements as far as Windows 10. So you just always go to the Windows 10 website, and it will list any updates that are required for you as far as any prerequisites. But as far as Config Manager, it's Config Man 1702 with the 1703 ADK. Those are what Microsoft says is required for deployment of Windows 10 1703 through Configuration Manager. It's Config Man 1702 because there's nothing later yet. Config Man current branch 1706 should be out in the next few weeks because it's due to come out this month, but you never know when they'll get done with all their testing on it. So it could very well likely shift into August before it's really available. But normally it comes out about the month after the dev process is ended. So 1706 would have ended last month. So normally you would have expected 1706 to come out this month, but it hasn't yet. So we don't know exactly when it will come out. So 1702 Config Manager, and then the ADK for Windows 10 1703 is what Microsoft says is required for deployment of Windows 10 1703. And then WSUS, just a current version of WSUS on your for whatever version of Windows server that you're running, either Windows Server 2012 R2 or Windows Server 2016. So just whatever the current version is. So I'm running WSUS 4.0. And if there's been any updates for WSUS 4.0 that have been applied, they may be in there, but there's nothing else as far other than just the supported version of WSUS for your version of Configuration Manager. And well, a lot of comments in there. Let's see if there's anything else. Has the install update process been improved? AKA, we only use Config Manager deploy updates, not WSUS. Roger. So every release of Config Manager, they do obviously make bug fixes to make software update process better. They make enhancements. For example, in 1610, I think it was, you could go in there and your 80K or your 80K, your ADRs, so automated deployment rule. You could go ahead and now set up a filter on content size. So they keep adding new features or fixing bugs or enhancements to make the update process more smooth and interactive. But yeah, you would want to use Config Manager if you have it to deploy software updates and not WSUS. You have a whole lot more control over software update deployment in Config Manager than you do with WSUS. Scheduling, you have the reporting capabilities, you have the maintenance windows in Config Manager, ADRs for the automation of it. You can do PowerShell if you want to. So a lot of people, okay, now I see what you're asking, installing updates via task sequences. So yeah, they have made some enhancements for task sequence deployments as well for software updates. Some of the things they've done recently is allowing you to specify a timeout value for your scanning. Because oftentimes you'd be way out of date and take a long time to do the scan process, you would time out. They have better logging now, so that if you do run into an issue, it points you to, from the SMSTS log file, it points you to the proper log file for software updates to go ahead and do its work. So they've made some enhancements in the task sequencing for logging, but also as well as far as the timeout values and scanning. And then the evaluation that I just showed you to use cached scan results as opposed to forcing a current scan if your results are already up to date. So they have been making some updates, and they try to do so fairly frequently to enhance. Now, one of the things we'll talk about next week, another advantage of using Config Manager, not necessarily task sequences, but Config Manager for this is Windows 10 deployments, is express updates that we'll talk about. And that's getting better at each build of Config Manager as well. So do we also have an option to perform the servicing through task sequence? You can certainly do updates to your Windows 10 clients utilizing task sequences instead of doing the Windows 10 servicing. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more next week in the management of Windows 10. But some people do like using task sequences for keeping their Windows versions up to date. As far as moving from 1511 to 1607 to 1703, some people like using task sequences. Some people are like using the servicing node. So there's some advantages of each. And right now, task sequencing generally seems to be a little bit more popular for doing upgrades of Windows, even Windows 10 from build to build. A lot of people do like using task sequences over the servicing node for that. Okay, so I think I've got everything in here answered right now. So I definitely will do that look in there to see the tablet edition. Figure that out for next week. We'll have that, and I'll just validate a couple more. I'll look at my image and see why my bare metal client didn't go, and I'll get him installed for next week, and then we'll pick up and talk about, now that I've got Windows 10 deployed, whether it's through bare metal, rip, replace, refresh, whatever my scenario is, break, fix, or the in-place upgrade. Now, what kind of management features do I have and capabilities do I have of it? So, all righty. with that, I think we are all done, and we are 20 minutes past with all your questions. So you guys are very, very inquisitive today. That's great. It makes things a whole lot more interesting when you guys are interactive. So I appreciate that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and we will be back. It's Tuesday next week, not Wednesday. So it's the 25th, not the 26th, is our presentation. So it's Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is the part 3, which would be management of Windows 10. So we'll talk about the servicing plans and rings, and then we'll look at some of the other features, like some of the compliance items. We'll talk about Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, and some of the other cool things that you get with Windows 10 environments that you can't necessarily do with your Windows 7 or Windows 8.1 through Configuration Manager. So that'll be the topic of next week. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you guys for attending. Hopefully you found it worthwhile, and hopefully you found out how not to deploy a bare metal client, since mine didn't work. But I'll get that going for us, and I'll let you know next week what our, let me write down that note as well, to remind you guys what our bare metal client issue was, and then tablet edition. And then we'll talk about those next week. So, all right, you guys have a great rest of your day and week, and see you guys all next Tuesday. Thanks all. Bye now.